Last time we talked about the why of genre. Now we're actually going to talk about genre itself. Hey everybody, and last week we talked about the why we should worry about Bible study. And this week I want to talk about what that means and how we're supposed to look at it. Now, I wanted to split this one big lesson up into two different things because there's a lot going on here. And to be honest, I'm not the best communicator. I don't talk very well. So I might lose a lot in translation, but I want you to hear what it is I'm saying and not what I actually said. See, there's two different things there, which plays into what we're going to talk about with genres tonight. So, leave your questions, leave your comments, give me a phone call, text message, whatever. Most of you have my information, so we're good on that front. So now, let's dive right in. Now, when we come to genre, most of us automatically slow down a little bit and take our time because that word is not very common. I mean, it's common, everybody knows it, and we use it, but we don't use it often in conversation. It doesn't come up every day. So the problem arises that when we do bring up those words in conversation, we tend to think about it in only that limited context in which we were talking. We're missing the bigger picture and the beauty of genre and what is there. Now, when we dig into it, we find that we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the actual language itself. And that's really important, too, because if you think about it, that's what we're studying in the Bible. It's all about words. It's language. So we really need to dive in, and we need to give ourselves a framework, because otherwise we can get lost really fast. And that framework really revolves around how we use language. Not really what we're saying, because I think that's pretty well understood, but how we're saying it. That is where we lose a lot in translation. Now, there's basically three ways that we can use language. One is equivocally. That's saying two different words in conversation, and they mean the same thing. That's kind of like you and your buddy, you just got out of the latest Marvel movie, and he goes, wow, that was an adventure. So you pipe up real quick, and you're like, yeah, that was a story and a half, man. Well, you both understood, and you both saw that adventure and the word story were both being used to describe and equate to the same thing. That's equivocation. And then you have equivocation, like ubiquitous. It's very flimsy. We don't understand what it means. And this is how we use the same word in two different scenarios, but it means different things. Kind of like the phrase, I love my wife, but I also love tacos. That's pretty amazing. We get some great mileage out of that word love, don't we? Now, that's a completely different series altogether, but it illustrates that point so amazingly because we know that we're talking about two different things. Loving your wife and loving tacos are on two different realms of existence, but we use that same word. It'd be a mistake to use that word equivocally. That's like somebody coming up to me. That's like when I took my kids out to play tennis the other day, and people said, wow, you're a pretty good tennis player. I'm like, not really, but I'm better than they are. And then they follow up with, I also have a friend that's really good. You guys should play together. His name's Roger Federer. We're not good at the same level. His level of good and my level of good are two completely different ideas. And that's what equivocally means. You're using the same word different ways. The third way is what we call analogically. We're making an analogy with our words. And that's what we use when we say figures of speech. It's something we use all the time. Like when you're a parent, you say, if I haven't told you once, I told you 1,000,000 times. But really? Have you told anybody anything 1,000,000 times? For real? That would take you the rest of your life. It doesn't work that way. That's not what they mean. What they mean is, dude, you should know that. I've told you 1,000,000 times. You know this already. The idea is they're saying that you should know what I'm talking about and you have no excuse versus the actual words they say. They're two different things, but you can analogize. You take your words, you're making a picture to mean something else. That's what analogize means. Now, usually when we're talking together, one-on-one, dinner table conversation, it's great. We all can understand that because we pick up on those things like tone of voice, the speed at which they talk, body language, all those things come into play. So we understand what way they're using their language, using their words. But when it comes to a piece of writing, we start to lose those things. That's where things like genre and context and grammar, they all come into play at this point. And that's what we want to talk about today. I want to talk about what genre is and what it means compared to those other things that we talk about, like story and narrative and context and grammar inside a piece of literature, specifically looking at the written word, right? Genre is actually a French word, and it just means kind. That's where we get the word gender from. This is genre. It's like, oh, there's a person. What kind of person? Oh, boy or girl. That's the way they would say it. And we all know what those kinds of genres are. I mean, is this a romance or a thriller? Is this a parable or a memoir? Is this a personal letter to some dude, or is this probably just a history? Is he listing out a chronicle of what happened? Like, all those things are genres. Now notice I didn't say fiction or nonfiction because that's really more of the mode of writing versus the genre or what they're writing. So let me dive into that. Bring the ideas of fiction and nonfiction in the Bible, we immediately think right or wrong, yes or no, true, false. And is there some validity to that? Yes, absolutely. But fiction, nonfiction, like I said, is a mode of writing, and it revolves more around a concept than an actual genre of writing. Let me give you an example. I know that sounds blasphemous almost, but let me give you an example, right? The parables of Christ. Turn to Luke 10 verse 30, about 7 verses or so. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan. He tells a story about a guy who leaves his home and was going to Jericho, but along the way he got jumped by a couple robbers. Well, along comes the Samaritan, and he takes care of the guy, and he binds up his wounds. He takes him to the hotel, gives him what's he needs to take care of the gentleman, and says, I'll pay the rest when I come back. Happy end story. The end result is Jesus used that story to drive home a very true, real message. But the question is that story real, or was it made up? Was it fake? Was it false? It was a flight of imagination. It was Jesus's imaginary story that he used to illustrate a earthly, real, spiritual principle. Now, does that mean it was false? No, but it was still a work of fiction. That's what we call storytelling. That's how it works. Now, stories can be true or not. Fiction is not true or not. It's the way you're telling your story. And that's what Jesus does. He took imaginary events and made them into something real. We can also do that the other way around. We can also take some real events and tell you a story that actually didn't happen, but is still in that story. For instance, the Song of Solomon. By all accounts, the Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs as it's called in the Hebrew Bible, the Song of Songs is King Solomon's greatest work. But we all know who Solomon was and what he was doing. I mean, that guy was the ultimate womanizer. I mean, that man had 900 women in his little black book. And that's not what we would consider couth and well today. He's not the example that we would put forward for a godly relationship or commitment inside a marriage. He's not the example we would give, but he wrote an amazing piece of work. And how did that happen? Well, because of what we know and because of who Solomon was, more than likely these things were real events. This was the personal history of the man Solomon. In fact, there's some scholars who believe that the Song of Solomon is actually a collection of correspondence between him and one of these women. But under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, right, that was packaged in such a way that he was able to show us a picture of amazing spirituality. And also at the same time, it's a model of earthly relationship building and how we're supposed to run our lives and our marriage. This is how fiction works. It's a real story giving us what was not intended, or it's an imaginary story giving us something that was intended. And that's how it works. This fiction nonfiction thing is very, very conceptual. You can take a work of pure nonfiction, real life, everyday materials, and dress that up and write it in such a way that it reads like a novel somewhere that you're seeing in a movie, and vice versa. You can take something that's totally made up and is a pure flight of fancy and put it in such a package that you read it, it sounds like the annals of history. Like J.R.R. Tolkien did that in his book, The Silmarillion. It's an amazing example of doing that exact thing. That's how the ideas, the concepts of truth and falsehood work in literature. And it gets even more confusing when you throw genre on top of that mix, because not only can it be conceptual, but now you can package that conception in very different ways. It can be a romance or a drama, or you can have action segments, or you can have memoir or flights of fancy in miracles or what you say. I'm not saying any of that's false when we come to the Bible. I'm saying that's how literature can work. So it's our job when we study to find out what's right and wrong. And that's what we're going to dive into in the next part. That's actually what the word narrative means. It means taking those different small stories, so segments, putting them together and weaving the overall big picture. And that's what we're going to dive into next time with the Old Testament narratives.